In the middle of a crowded city street, a blind black widow stands, tapping her cane to navigate her way through the hustle and bustle. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a racist cop approaches, growing increasingly hostile for no reason. "You don't belong here. Move out of the way. I'm just trying to get to the bus stop, officer." But instead of backing down, the officer snatches the cane from her hands and snaps it in two with a cruel laugh, showing his utter disrespect. "Hold up. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. If you want to see how this shocking moment unfolds, like and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable stories." What the racist cop doesn't know is that her daughter, someone he never expected, is about to turn the tables in ways he never saw coming. Stay tuned for the twist. The sun was setting over the busy city streets, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. In the distance, the sound of car horns and chattering pedestrians filled the air. In the midst of the chaos stood Martha Williams, a blind black widow in her mid-50s, carefully navigating her way with the help of her cane. Every tap against the ground was a guide to her world, as she walked confidently but slowly, her dark sunglasses concealing the tears that often welled up in her eyes from the loss of her husband years ago. Though the world around her was a blur, Martha had become an expert at listening to her environment. The click of a shoe, the distant rumble of a bus, or even the gentle hum of someone approaching, each sound guided her. But today something felt off. As she moved along, she could sense the crowd thinning around her, a shift in the air, and then he appeared. The racist cop stepped into her path. "You're blocking the sidewalk, lady," he barked, his tone sharp and dismissive. His uniform was pristine, but his face, twisted with disdain, betrayed the ugliness within. He towered over her, blocking the space she needed to pass. Martha, ever the composed woman, hesitated for a moment, then calmly responded, "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean to." Her voice was steady, but a small part of her was starting to feel the unease in her gut, the way people often mistook her quiet demeanor for weakness. The cop didn't step aside. Instead, he took a step forward, his hands at his sides, and with a sudden motion, he yanked her cane out of her hands. The action was so fast and so violent that Martha almost stumbled. She gasped, reaching forward to regain her balance, but the cop didn't seem to care. "What's wrong with you, huh? You can't even walk properly. Maybe you should just stay at home," the cop sneered, twisting the cane in his hands. Martha's heart pounded. This wasn't just an inconvenience, this was dehumanization. She had experienced prejudice before, but this felt different. It wasn't just a matter of being black. It was about the disrespect for her existence, her struggle, and her autonomy. "Please, officer," Martha said, her voice low but firm. "That's my only means of support. Please, give it back." She reached out, but the officer just chuckled, enjoying the control he had over the situation. Before she could react, he snapped the cane in half with a sickening crack. The sound echoed through the busy street, making a few pedestrians pause and glance over, but none of them dared to intervene. "What now, huh?" the officer mocked. "Guess you'll have to crawl back home now. Get lost." Martha stood there, her hands trembling at her sides. The pain from the broken cane was nothing compared to the humiliation. The world had just become a little darker for her. She was a widow, a woman who had already lost so much, and now this officer was trying to take away the last semblance of her independence. As she stood motionless, the world around her seemed to spin, but she refused to show weakness. Tasha Williams, Martha's daughter, had just come out of a nearby store when she noticed her mother's distress. At first, she couldn't understand what was happening, but as she moved closer, she saw the officer holding the broken cane in his hands, a smirk on his face. Tasha's eyes widened in horror. Her mother, her brave, strong mother, was being targeted, and no one was stepping in. Tasha knew she couldn't let this go. She had spent years training, not just in the military but in life itself. She had always been Martha's protector, but now, in this moment, it wasn't just about shielding her mother from harm, it was about standing up for justice. Tasha's military training wasn't something she had ever talked about openly. She had deliberately kept her identity hidden, blending into the background away from the public eye. The training had been intense, and the missions she had participated in had sharpened her skills to the point where she could take on anyone, no matter how big or dangerous they were. But being the quiet daughter had always been her role, until now. With controlled fury, Tasha approached the officer. "Give it back," she said coldly. Her voice was sharp, the tone of someone who had been pushed too far. The cop turned his head, his sneer morphing into confusion when he saw Tasha standing there, eyes locked on him, unblinking. "What do you want?" he growled, clearly not recognizing the woman in front of him. Tasha didn't flinch. She could feel the tension in the air, but she was ready to act. "You don't know who I am," she said, each word punctuated with resolve. "But you will, and if you don't give that back, things are going to get a lot worse for you." The officer's eyes narrowed, dismissing her words as a threat. But he was wrong. He didn't know who Tasha really was. As the confrontation reached its boiling point, a crowd began to gather. People were whispering, some filming the interaction with their phones, but no one stepped forward to intervene. This wasn't a new story to them. This was an everyday occurrence, racism and abuse of power on the streets. But they hadn't counted on Tasha. The officer, still holding the broken cane, took a step toward her. "What are you going to do? You think you can take me down?" He laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. He was starting to realize that Tasha wasn't just some random woman. There was something in her eyes, something calculated, that made him hesitate. "You don't know who you're messing with," Tasha repeated, her voice ice-cold. The officer took another step forward, but before he could react, Tasha's hand moved like lightning, grabbing his wrist and twisting it with a swift motion, causing him to drop the cane. The crowd gasped. The officer staggered back, clutching his wrist in pain, his face twisted with disbelief. He had been caught off guard, and now in front of a growing crowd, he was starting to realize that this wasn't going to be an easy confrontation. His mind raced. Who was this woman? What was she capable of? Tasha stood tall, her posture unwavering. Her military training had taught her how to read people, how to move quickly and decisively. She knew how to defuse a situation, how to fight if necessary. But she wasn't looking for a fight. She just wanted the officer to understand that he couldn't continue to bully her mother, not without facing the consequences. "I said give it back," Tasha repeated, her voice calm but fierce. She stepped closer to the officer, her eyes never leaving his. The officer, still clutching his wrist, sneered, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The crowd had begun to murmur, their phones raised to capture every moment. Tasha could feel the weight of their stares, but she didn't care. She wasn't doing this for an audience. She was doing this for her mother, and for herself. "What's going on here?" A new voice broke through the tension, and both Tasha and the officer turned to see a second cop approaching. This one was younger, with a much less intimidating presence than the first officer, but his eyes darted nervously between Tasha and the other officer. "Is everything okay?" the younger cop asked, his hand hovering near his holstered gun, unsure of how to handle the situation. Tasha kept her focus on the first officer, still holding his wrist with a steady grip. "I'd like him to give my mother back her cane," she said, as though this was the simplest request in the world. The younger cop looked at his partner, still grimacing in pain. He could see that the situation was escalating quickly, and there was something about Tasha's unshakable demeanor that told him this wasn't going to end well if they didn't handle it carefully. The first officer, still reeling from the pain in his wrist, glared at Tasha. He was humiliated, angry. How could this woman, this black woman, have the audacity to stand up to him? He was a cop. He had power. She was nothing. "You think I'm going to let you get away with this?" The first officer snarled. His pride was wounded, and his anger flared as he glared at Tasha. But before he could react further, Tasha's voice cut through the tension once again. "I don't care what you think you can do. You messed with the wrong person today." The officer stepped back, anger bubbling beneath the surface, but the younger cop hesitated. He was beginning to realize that Tasha wasn't someone to be taken lightly. This wasn't just a confrontation between two people. It was about something bigger. The first officer's pride swelled again as he straightened, trying to regain some of the control he felt slipping away. "I don't care if you're some kind of military agent. You're still a criminal. I'll make sure you regret this." Tasha's eyes hardened. She had heard enough. "I'm not your enemy," she said, her voice calm but laced with authority. "But if you keep pushing, you'll find out who I really am." The second officer, now clearly uncomfortable, stepped forward. He wasn't sure what to do. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but he also didn't want to be seen as weak in front of his partner. The tension was thick in the air, and he was starting to regret ever getting involved in this mess. "Let's all just take a step back," he said, trying to defuse the situation, his voice unsure. "There's no need for this to go any further. You're both civilians. Let's just—" But before he could finish his sentence, Tasha's hand released the officer's wrist. She took a step back and straightened her posture, giving him a piercing, defiant stare. The moment was charged with anticipation, and the entire scene felt as though it were hanging on the edge of a razor-sharp blade. The first officer finally took a deep breath and reluctantly handed the broken cane back to Tasha. But as he did so, a sinister smirk appeared on his face. "You think this is over?" he muttered. "You don't know who you're messing with. You have no idea what's coming next." But Tasha was already turning away, holding her mother's cane in her hands, the broken tip a reminder of the brutality she had just faced. She didn't need to hear the officer's threats. She had already made her point. The second officer, looking uncertain, hesitated for a moment longer before following his partner's lead, walking away without another word. The crowd around them slowly began to disperse, the tension easing as the moment came to an end. Tasha turned to face her mother, a soft smile on her face. "You okay, Mom?" Martha nodded, though her face showed a trace of concern. "I'm fine, honey, but I'm proud of you." Tasha's heart swelled with pride, but the weight of the situation still lingered in the back of her mind. The officers had left, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. There would be consequences for what had just transpired, consequences for them, and for her. Tasha wasn't done. This was only the beginning. As the crowd dispersed and the sound of footsteps faded into the distance, Tasha stood there, gripping her mother's cane. The broken tip was a reminder of the humiliation her mother had just endured, but also of the officer's mistake, one that had only just begun to unravel. Martha, still shaken, adjusted her sunglasses as though to shield herself from the world's gaze. Though the confrontation was over, the sting of the racist cop's aggression lingered in the air. She had lived through so much already, but this was something different. She had never expected to be treated like this, especially in public, especially not after so many years of quiet strength. But now, in this moment, something inside Tasha clicked. She wasn't just her mother's protector anymore. She was a woman on a mission. The cop's words, his attitude, everything about the way he treated her mother felt like an insult to their very existence. And she wouldn't let it slide. "I'll be okay, sweetheart," Martha said, her voice soft but reassuring. "You don't have to worry about me." But Tasha knew better. Her mother might have lived through adversity with grace, but Tasha wasn't ready to let go of what had just happened. Her military training wasn't just about being strong physically. It was about standing up for the oppressed, even when they felt voiceless. She wouldn't let this incident fade into the background. It would become the catalyst for something much bigger. "Mom," Tasha said, her voice low but determined, "this isn't over. I'm going to make sure they never forget what they did today." Her words hung in the air like a promise. Martha gave her daughter a long, searching look, as if understanding that Tasha's words weren't just empty declarations. She could see the fire in her daughter's eyes, the same fire that had fueled her through the darkest moments of her own life. But Martha knew, all too well, the price of fighting this kind of battle. She had seen the toll it took on people, the sacrifices they made, the way they often found themselves alone in the end. Yet there was no stopping Tasha now. She wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting for her family's dignity. Meanwhile, across town, the two racist cops who had assaulted Martha were back at their precinct, trying to brush off what had just happened. They had seen too many people like her, too many faces they could dismiss without a second thought. But what had started as a typical routine stop was beginning to feel like something much more significant. Harrison, the older of the two officers, was pacing in his small office, grumbling to himself. She should have known better than to talk back like that. We were just trying to put her in her place. His younger partner, Officer Blake, sat at his desk, flipping through some paperwork, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. He had seen the way Jonathan, the black man, had reacted to the situation. "She wasn't even doing anything wrong, Harrison, but the way you treated her like she didn't matter was just too much." He paused, almost as though the realization was just dawning on him. "We shouldn't have done that." Harrison spun around, his face flushed with anger. "She was asking for it. She made a scene, and we had to do something to put her in her place." "You're going soft on me, Blake." Blake hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. He didn't like the way Harrison was talking, but he was still new to this. He wanted to fit in, wanted to belong, but this was starting to feel wrong. "Maybe we should report this just to make sure everything's documented," Blake suggested, trying to hide his unease. Harrison scoffed. "Report it? For what? So someone can take her side?" He walked over to the desk and slammed his fist down. "We're the law here, Blake. She's just some woman who didn't know her place." Blake sat back, glancing out the window, the seed of doubt growing in his mind. The way Martha had stood her ground, the way Tasha had spoken up, it wasn't normal. There was something different about them. They weren't backing down, and that made him uncomfortable. The scene at the bus stop was the beginning of something bigger, but Tasha didn't know it yet. She and her mother walked away from the confrontation, unaware that the officers were already plotting their next move. As they made their way back to their apartment, Tasha couldn't help but replay the events in her head. The cop had humiliated her mother, but more than that, he had disrespected them both. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind. She had felt it the moment the officer had backed off, the feeling that things weren't going to just go away. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're not done yet, they won't let this go, you need to act fast." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the tone. This was bigger than just her mother's cane. Someone had noticed what happened, and they were telling her to get ready for the fight ahead. Tasha's hand clenched into a fist, and she looked at her mother, who was walking just a few steps ahead of her. "I'm going to make sure they pay for this," she muttered, her voice cold. Martha, sensing the intensity in her daughter's tone, stopped and turned toward her. "What are you planning, Tasha?" Tasha's eyes met her mother's, and for the first time she could see the depth of concern in her face. "You'll see," Tasha said, her words sharp with resolve. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on Tasha's shoulders as she walked alongside her mother, but her mind was already shifting to the next step. She had always known her purpose. Being her mother's protector was a role she cherished. But today that role had expanded. What started as an injustice against Martha had become a call to arms for Tasha. She needed to find out who was behind this, who was really pulling the strings. The cops, the systemic racism, the humiliation, it was all connected. And the officers weren't just going to get away with it, not while she had breath in her lungs. Tasha took out her phone again. The message from the unknown number still burned into her mind. "You're not done yet. They won't let this go. You need to act fast." Something in that message rang a bell. Who was watching? Who knew what had happened at the bus stop? And why had they sent her this warning? She decided it was time to find out. Meanwhile, across town, the racist officers were regrouping, still furious about the scene with Martha. Harrison, the older officer, paced back and forth in their small office, fuming over the embarrassment he'd suffered in front of that black woman. "I should have thrown her in the back of the squad car, but you had to play the nice guy," Harrison grumbled, glaring at Blake. Blake, clearly uncomfortable with how things had unfolded, shifted uneasily in his seat. He had been part of the force for a while, but this was different. He had never seen a woman stand up to them like that, and certainly never with such confidence. And Tasha, her fierce gaze still lingered in his memory. There was something in the way she spoke that unnerved him. "Look, we're not done here," Harrison continued. "That woman crossed a line. We need to make sure she knows her place." Blake shifted in his seat again, unsure whether he should argue. Deep down, a small part of him knew something was wrong about their actions, but his partner's influence kept him from saying anything. Harrison had a way of intimidating him, of making him feel small if he didn't follow along. Harrison wasn't backing down, and he was going to make sure that the black woman who dared to stand up to him didn't get away with it. He had his eyes set on Tasha. He needed to show her that there were consequences for defying him. Back at the safe house, Tasha was already making plans. She knew that the system the officers were part of was corrupt, but she needed more than just a hunch. She needed evidence. She had been a soldier, trained in covert operations, gathering intel, and carrying out missions with precision. Now that training would be her greatest asset in the battle she was about to face. Tasha pulled up a list of the officers she had already encountered, Harrison included. She knew the names, but now it was time to dig deeper. Time to find the links, the connections, the dirty deals that could bring the entire system crashing down. "You're going down, Harrison," she muttered to herself as she typed away on her laptop. The name Harrison flashed across her screen again, but this time it was attached to a file, one that would lead her to the heart of the corruption. As Tasha scrolled through the file, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a list of high-ranking officials, police officers, and even politicians, all tied to a network of extortion, bribery, and systemic racism. This was no small-time operation. It was a well-oiled machine, with deep roots in the very city that Tasha had called home her whole life. Her jaw clenched as she read further, but what caught her attention was a single name on the list: Blake, the younger officer, the one who had seemed hesitant during the confrontation. He was listed as a key player, someone involved in the covert operations that were being run by the corrupt faction of the police department. Tasha leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Blake was the weak link. He was new, still unsure, and he had shown signs of doubt during the altercation. He wasn't as ruthless as Harrison, but he had enough of a connection to the group to be dangerous. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. It was another text from the unknown number. "They know what you're doing. They're coming for you. Don't trust anyone." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. The message had come too soon, too fast. Whoever was watching her was keeping tabs on every move. She couldn't trust anyone, not even those who might seem like allies. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she thought. If she wanted to stop this conspiracy, she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, but she had to be careful. She couldn't afford to be compromised. At the same time, Harrison was making plans of his own. He knew that Tasha wouldn't back down, and neither would her mother, but the longer they stayed in the dark, the worse it would get. Harrison had crossed a line, but this wasn't just about putting down a civilian. It was about making sure that no one challenged him ever again. His plan was simple. He would use the system against Tasha, using her mother to draw her out. He knew exactly how to manipulate people like Tasha, people who thought they were fighting for justice, but Harrison had a secret of his own, a network that stretched far beyond the city, and he was ready to use it. Tasha wouldn't know what hit her. The tension in the air had never been thicker. Tasha's mind was racing as she pieced together the final elements of her plan. The evidence, the files, and the cryptic messages, everything had pointed her in one direction. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. Every second that ticked by brought her closer to being discovered, and the deeper she dug into the corruption within the police department, the more dangerous her situation became. As she sat in the safe house, her mind focused on the next move. She felt a shift. It was as if everything was building toward a reckoning, a final showdown. And it wasn't just about her mother anymore. This fight was about exposing the entire corrupt system. Tasha glanced down at the files, her fingers tracing the names of the officers involved, but one name stood out: Blake. She knew Harrison was the ringleader, the one pulling all the strings, but Blake was the key. He was the one who was beginning to show signs of doubt, the one she could use to her advantage. He had been uneasy during the confrontation with her mother, and he had no idea how deeply involved he was in the conspiracy. It was time to confront him. Meanwhile, Harrison was busy finalizing his plans. He was on the phone with one of his contacts in the higher ranks of the police department, making arrangements to deal with Tasha once and for all. She won't know what hit her, Harrison muttered into the phone, his eyes narrowing with a look of cold resolve. He had a few more tricks up his sleeve, and Tasha wouldn't be able to outmaneuver him. She had been naive to think she could take down the entire corrupt system on her own. No one was untouchable, but Harrison underestimated Tasha's resolve. She wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting for something much deeper, something that had been instilled in her since she was a child. She wouldn't stop until the truth was exposed, no matter what it cost her. Tasha arrived at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, the location that had been agreed upon for her meeting with Blake. She had set this up carefully, knowing that the officer would never expect her to come to him. But the tables had turned. She wasn't going to be intimidated by his badge or his uniform. Today she was the one in control. As she stepped inside, her eyes scanned the room for Blake. The place was nearly empty, except for a few late-night patrons. She found him sitting in the far corner, looking out of place in his uniform. Blake looked nervous, glancing around like he wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing. Tasha approached him, taking a seat across from him without a word. Blake looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low. Tasha didn't waste time. She laid the flash drive on the table between them. "I want you to tell me everything," she said firmly. "You're already in this up to your neck. You don't have to go down with them." Blake's eyes darted nervously between Tasha and the door, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. His mind was clearly conflicted. He had always been a part of the system, but now, sitting across from the woman whose life he had helped ruin, he realized that he was no different from the corrupt officers he had once sworn to bring to justice. "I didn't want to get involved," Blake muttered, his hands shaking slightly. "I didn't know how deep it went. They're too powerful, too connected, but I've seen what they're capable of." Tasha leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Then you have a choice. You can stay loyal to them, or you can help me take them down. You don't get to sit on the sidelines anymore." Blake's breath caught in his throat. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like 1,000 pounds. Tasha could see the internal struggle in his eyes. This was his moment to decide who he wanted to be. Did he want to continue being a part of the machine that perpetuated injustice, or did he want to make things right? "I can't do this alone," Blake whispered, his voice almost pleading. "I'm not strong enough to fight them." Tasha's eyes softened, but there was still a steel-like determination behind them. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm not asking you to fight by yourself. I'm asking you to stand for what's right." There was a long silence before Blake nodded slowly. "I'll help you." The next few days were a blur of planning and strategy. Tasha and Blake worked together in secret, gathering the information they needed to expose the officers and the corruption that ran deep within the department. Blake provided her with intel, names, and evidence, things that would finally bring Harrison and his crew to justice. But as the day of reckoning approached, Harrison wasn't blind to what was happening. He had already begun to make his own moves, calling in favors and preparing for the inevitable showdown. He wasn't going to go down without a fight.